Alright guys, so section 7.5 complex numbers, we are actually going to do division today. So if we remember, I is the square root of -1. What was one of the rules that we had about square roots with fractions? The rule is we cannot have a square root in the denominator of a fraction. That's one of the rules. So we need to get rid of it somehow by multiplying by the least possible thing, top and bottom, because that value is equal to 1, to remove the square root from the denominator. So number 1, 6 over I. We're leaving it as I on the denominator, but in our mind we're thinking square root of -1. So the rule is we cannot have any i's left in the denominator. So if I is a square root of -1, what's the least thing that we could multiply I by to get rid of the square root sign, and that's itself? So we are going to multiply top and bottom by I. So we are left with 6i over I squared. We learned in the previous video that I squared equals -1. So we have 6i over -1. Please don't leave it that way. That simplifies to -6i. Final answer. Number 2. 6 is not under the square root sign. 6 is by itself. I is the square root of -1. So in order to get rid of the I in the denominator, we're multiplying top and bottom by I. We're going to need to distribute, so let's put parentheses around the numerator there. Our denominator is 6i squared, which simplifies to -6. Our numerator, we need to distribute I to both pieces. So we have 3i minus 2i squared. Whenever we see I squared, we need to change it to a -1. So that's going to be a +2. 3i stays 3i. Our standard form that we learned in the previous video is A plus BI. They are two terms. So we need to separate 3i plus 2 all over -6. So let's first distribute that negative sign to both of the numerator pieces. So we have -3i minus 2 over 6. Writing that in standard form, let's rewrite -2 minus 3i over 6. We break that up into two fractions. So -2/6 minus 3i over 6. That simplifies to -1/3 minus 1/2 I. You can write I over 2 if you want, but in standard form, this is how you would write it. So break it up into two fractions. So you have to break it up for standard form into two fractions. So in the box, that's the final answer. All right, what happens when we have two pieces in the denominator? Think back to when we had two terms in the denominator with a square root, and we had the conjugate. Now these, the conjugate, have complex numbers, so these are what we call complex conjugates. So 2 plus I, its conjugate to get rid of I is going to be 2 minus I, due to the top. We're going to need to FOIL, so let's put parentheses around here. In the denominator, foiling that, 2 times 2 is 4. Your inner and your outer terms cancel, so we don't need to write them. And then minus I squared, so that is 4 plus 1, which is 5 in the denominator. Make a note here. Whenever multiplying complex conjugates, these two things here are going to be your a squared plus b squared from your a plus bi. If you forget that, you can always just FOIL and go back to it. Let's go up here and FOIL the numerator. 1 times 2 is 2. 1 times -I, and a -4i. So that'll be 2 minus 5i, and your last term here, plus 2i squared, will be minus 2. Oh, so look, that cancels there. So we have -5i over 5. So your answer, we can cancel the 5. So your answer for this one will be, if that was -4i over 5, you would just leave it as is. Notice there is no two terms. So for a plus bi, a might be 0, and that's okay, and you just leave it with the term with I in it. All right, for number 4, let's first rewrite any negative square roots. with I instead of the negative sign being under the square roots first. And also any square roots that can be simplified, let's do that first. So the square root of negative 8, we've done this one a couple of times in the previous video. So the square root of negative 8 is 2I square root of 2 over the square root of 6 minus I root 2. I'm going to run out of room here. All right, the complex conjugate of our denominator is the square root of 6 plus I root 2. What we do to the bottom, we must do to the top. This is all one term here. Our denominator, let's go over here. A squared plus B squared. Our A is the square root of 6. So the square root of 6 squared is just 6 plus our B squared, which is the square root of 2. So that is just going to be plus 2. If you need to see it off to the side here, that would be the square root of 36 minus I squared times the square root of 4. So 6 minus 2, I squared becomes plus, so that's where the 6 plus 2 comes from. Numerator. I'm going to run out of room, so I need to rewrite this a little bit. So the denominator was 6 plus 2, which is 8. 6 plus 2, which is 8. Numerator, we're distributing each piece here. So 2I stays on the outside, square root of 12. 2I root 2 times I root 2 is 2I squared root 4. So let's simplify as much as we can here. So 8's on the bottom. The square root of 12, we can take out a 2 because square root of 4 and 3. So we're bringing out a 2. So we have 4I root 3. Square root of 4 is 2. So 2 times 2 is 4. And our I squared changes this to a negative. Writing this in standard form, our A comes first. So we have negative 4 over 8. So negative 4 over 8 plus 4I root 3 over 8. This would simplify to negative 1/2 plus the square root of 3 over 2. And I'm putting I last because of standard form. B comes first and then I. So this is the final answer. The 4 and the 8 simplified to 1 over 2. And the square root of 3 is still there. So in the box, that is the final answer. All right, so this is division and rationalizing the denominator with complex numbers. Thanks, guys.